Sarah Mitchell stood on the cracked clay soil of her newly purchased property in rural Texas and felt the weight of every single judgmental stare burning holes through her back. The real estate agent had practically begged her not to sign the papers yet. Her mother had cried on the phone for 3 consecutive hours until her voice gave out. Her former co-workers had sent her cruel memes about failed farming attempts and midlife crisis breakdowns that they thought were hilarious. Her ex-husband had texted that he hoped she found professional help before she lost her remaining sanity and ended up homeless. But Sarah saw something in that parched and abandoned plot of land that nobody else possessed the vision to see. She saw possibility where everyone else saw only poverty and foolishness. She saw medicine where everyone else saw mistakes and weeds. She saw a future where everyone else saw a dead end. And within 18 months, that same 1-Acre Wasteland would generate more revenue than her entire previous corporate career had managed in a decade of grinding overtime and sacrificed weekends. This is the story of how a completely broken woman turned broken soil into a thriving $2 million herb empire by learning to listen to the land when everyone else was too busy laughing at her to hear what it was saying. Sarah did not grow up on a farm. She did not inherit agricultural wisdom from generations of soil-tilling ancestors who understood the rhythm of seasons and the language of rainfall. She grew up in a cramped third-floor apartment in Houston, where the closest thing to nature was the potted plastic fern her grandmother kept on the kitchen windowsill and occasionally dusted with religious devotion. Her childhood was defined by concrete and caution, and the constant low-grade anxiety of financial instability that hummed beneath every conversation like a faulty air conditioner that never got fixed. Her parents worked double shifts at factories and restaurants, instilling in her a singular belief that security came only from corporate desks and steady paychecks, and never from anything as unpredictable as soil or weather or dreams. Sarah absorbed this lesson with the desperate hunger of someone who had watched eviction notices slide under doors and utility shut-off warnings pile on countertops. She studied finance at a state university, graduated with honors despite working 30 hours a week at a coffee shop, and marched directly into the glass tower of a regional investment firm with the pride of someone who had finally escaped her parents' cycle of poverty. For 12 years, she wore pencil skirts and calculated other people's wealth, while her own soul withered. She traded her 20s and 30s for quarterly bonuses and retirement account projections that never seemed to grow fast enough. She married a man who worked in commercial real estate and understood spreadsheets, but not sorrow. They bought a modest house in the suburbs with a lawn she never had time to tend. They posted vacation photos on social media that captured smiles, but not the silence between them. From the outside, Sarah Mitchell had built the exact life her parents had prayed for her entire childhood. But inside, something was rotting with a smell that no perfume could mask. The first tragedy struck on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, when the world was supposed to be waking to spring, but instead delivered destruction. Sarah arrived at her downtown Houston office to find federal security guards blocking the elevator banks and men in dark suits carrying boxes of files out through the service entrances. The firm was under federal investigation for securities fraud that her department had known nothing about. Within hours, her entire division was terminated without severance or explanation beyond a legal disclaimer about corporate restructuring. 12 years of loyalty and missed birthdays and sacrificed friendships evaporated in a single cold email from Human Resources. She packed her desk belongings into a cardboard box, while her former boss, the man who had mentored her for a decade, avoided eye contact and hurried past her toward the parking garage without a word. The second tragedy followed 6 weeks later, when her husband of 8 years announced over a silent dinner that he was leaving. He had met someone younger, someone who still laughed easily at parties, someone who had not been drained dry by corporate warfare and constant anxiety. He packed his bags on a Saturday afternoon while Sarah sat on their kitchen tile floor, unable to process the parallel collapse of her professional identity and her personal foundation. The third tragedy came silently like a thief in the night, stealing what little remained. 2 months after the divorce finalized and the legal papers stopped arriving, Sarah visited her doctor for persistent fatigue that had progressed from tiredness to bone-deep exhaustion. The blood work revealed severe adrenal burnout, chronic systemic inflammation, and early warning signs of an autoimmune condition that would require lifelong management. Her body was literally shutting down from years of stress she had normalized as ambition. The doctor prescribed pharmaceuticals, but quietly suggested she consider reducing stress in ways that seemed impossibly distant. Sarah laughed bitterly in that examination room, the sound hollow and broken. Reduce stress with no job, no marriage, no health insurance, and mounting medical bills that arrived with terrifying regularity. She was 39 years old and standing at absolute zero, with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to fall. Her mother offered her childhood bedroom with the same plastic fern still sitting on the windowsill. Her friends suggested therapy and online job applications and the kind of positive thinking that people offer when they have never truly been emptied. But Sarah could not bear the thought of rebuilding the same life that had just destroyed her from the inside out. She needed radical change that terrified everyone who heard about it. She needed to touch something real, something that did not exist in spreadsheets or performance reviews or divorce decrees. During a desperate late-night internet search about alternative healing and stress reduction that felt like grasping at straws, she stumbled across an article about adaptogenic herbs and their ability to help the body recover from chronic stress. Something stirred in her chest with an intensity that surprised her. She remembered her grandmother's plastic fern and the way the old woman had talked about plants having spirits and medicine in their leaves that science was only beginning to understand. Sarah drove to the countryside the following weekend without any plan beyond escaping the city that had become her prison. She found herself on dusty back roads surrounded by farmland that stretched toward the horizon in shades of green and gold that hurt her city-adapted eyes. She stopped at a roadside diner, where the coffee tasted like burnt courage, and overheard 2 farmers complaining about a property that would not sell despite being listed for years. 1 acre of useless clay that mocked every attempt at cultivation. Nothing grew there except stubborn weeds that refused to die. The county wanted it off the tax rolls. Sarah finished her coffee, left a tip she could not afford, and asked for the address with a voice that trembled only slightly. When she pulled up to the property, she understood immediately why people laughed and why the land had become a local joke. The soil was grey and cracked like dried riverbed that had forgotten the taste of water. Scraggly patches of greenish weeds poked through the surface in random clusters that seemed to follow no pattern known to agriculture. A rusted fence leaned sideways, as if exhausted from standing. There was no well, no barn, no infrastructure beyond a gravel driveway that dissolved into mud at the first hint of rain. The neighbouring farmers had nicknamed it the Devil's Acre, with the kind of superstitious dread that rural communities attach to things they cannot explain. Children dared each other to run across it during summer because nothing ever grew tall enough to hide a snake or provide shade. The real estate listing had been active for 4 years, with price reductions that still attracted no interest. The price was laughably low because the previous owner had died alone, and his children lived in California and wanted nothing to do with rural Texas problems or memories. Sarah walked that acre for 3 hours under the burning sun. She knelt in the dirt and felt its texture against her fingertips. She touched the weeds and noticed their resilience. She felt the sun burning her neck and something else burning in her chest that she had not felt in years: hope. And she decided to buy it with a certainty that felt like madness to everyone else, but felt like destiny to her. Every single person in her life told her she was having a breakdown that required professional intervention. Her mother threatened to have her committed for her own protection. Her former best friend sent her articles about midlife crises in women and the warning signs of mental collapse. Her ex-husband texted that he hoped she got help before she made decisions she could not undo. But Sarah signed the papers and emptied her remaining savings into the most ridiculed piece of land in the county. And in that moment, she felt more alive than she had in 12 years of corporate success. The first failure came immediately and without mercy. Sarah moved into a used RV she bought with her last credit card balance and parked on the gravel edge of her property where it looked as out of place as she felt. She bought gardening books from a used bookstore and seeds from the local feed store, with the optimistic ignorance of someone who had never grown anything except debt. She spent 3 weeks clearing patches of soil with hand tools that blistered her soft office worker palms and planting basic vegetables that represented her idea of farming: tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, zucchini and carrots. She watered them religiously from jugs she filled at a neighbour's spigot. She spoke to them in the morning like her grandmother had spoken to a plastic fern. She played classical music from a solar-powered radio that died every afternoon. Within a month, every single plant had withered with a speed that seemed personally insulting. The clay soil rejected her efforts with indifferent cruelty that matched the world's rejection of her dreams. The vegetables turned yellow, then brown, then dissolved into the earth, as if the land itself was mocking her agricultural ignorance. Sarah sat in her RV at night and cried until her throat ached and her eyes swelled shut. She had spent her last money on seeds and tools and hope, and now she could not even grow a single tomato to save herself from starvation. The second failure followed in August, when she attempted to build a greenhouse that would protect her future plants from the cruel Texas elements. She bought a kit online with her maxed credit card and spent 2 weeks assembling the metal frame with instructions that seemed written in a foreign language. The first thunderstorm of autumn collapsed the entire structure with a sound like defeated dreams. Bent poles and torn plastic sheeting littered her acre like metallic skeletons that whispered of her incompetence. She tried to salvage the frame, but cut her hand badly enough to require 8 stitches at the emergency room, where the nurse's pity was worse than the pain. The bill arrived weeks later, and she stared at it, knowing her credit was now as broken as her land and her spirit. The third failure came in October when she attempted to sell the property and escape her mistake. She listed it for exactly what she had paid, desperate to cut her losses and return to Houston with whatever dignity remained in her shattered existence. Not a single person called. The real estate agent she hired stopped returning her calls after the second week. Sarah spent Thanksgiving alone in her RV, eating cold canned beans and watching rain streak down the windows, while the rest of the country celebrated family and gratitude. She was 40 years old, unemployed, divorced, sick, and now officially the owner of the most worthless acre in Texas, according to everyone who knew anything about land. The laughter from her former life echoed constantly in her mind like a cruel soundtrack she could not silence. December brought the turning point that would rewrite everything about her understanding of value and growth and purpose. Sarah had stopped fighting the land with the exhausted resignation of someone who had nothing left to fight with. She spent her days simply walking the property in slow circles, observing what grew without her intervention or her ignorant attempts at control. She noticed that certain patches of weeds remained defiantly green even when everything else had died under the first frost. She noticed that these same weeds attracted butterflies and bees in October when nothing else flowered or offered pollen. She started photographing them with her cracked smartphone and using internet searches to identify what she had previously dismissed as useless vegetation. The results stunned her into a silence that lasted for hours. The scraggly purple-flowered weed that covered the northeast corner was Echinacea purpurea, a powerful immune-boosting herb used in natural medicine for centuries by indigenous healers. The yellow flowering clusters in the drainage ditch were St. John's wort, valued for mood support and nervous system healing that Sarah needed desperately. The fuzzy silver leaves near the fence line were mullein, traditionally used for respiratory conditions, with a history older than pharmaceuticals. The tiny white flowers that smelled like honey when she crushed them between her fingers were chamomile, the same herb her grandmother had brewed for sleepless nights. Sarah sat in the dirt that afternoon and wept for an entirely different reason than she had wept before. Her wasteland was not empty. It was a fully stocked pharmacy that nature had built over decades, while humans laughed and called it worthless. The previous owners had abandoned it because they saw only weeds that refused to submit to plows. Sarah saw medicine because her desperation had forced her to look closer than anyone else had bothered to look. The land had been trying to tell its story for decades, but nobody had been desperate enough or broken enough to stop talking and start listening. She was the first person to stop trying to dominate the soil and instead ask what it wanted to give her if she would only accept its gifts on its own terms. The first year of transformation began with observation rather than intervention, with listening rather than demanding. Sarah stopped clearing patches and started mapping them with the precision her finance background finally made useful. She identified 17 distinct medicinal plant species growing wild across her single acre, each with specific harvesting windows and preparation methods. She harvested small quantities by hand with gratitude rather than greed, drying them in her RV, using screens made from old window frames she salvaged from a junk pile. She researched traditional preparation methods from books she borrowed through interlibrary loan. She made her first tincture in a mason jar with inexpensive vodka and Echinacea root she harvested after the first hard frost when the plant's energy had retreated into its roots. She drank it daily, and noticed her energy improving within weeks in ways that her expensive prescriptions had never achieved. Her autoimmune symptoms began stabilizing rather than worsening. She stopped needing 3-hour naps every afternoon. The land was healing her as she learned to work with it instead of against it. She spent her evenings reading about herbalism, permaculture, and sustainable wildcrafting until her eyes burned. She connected with online communities of herbalists who encouraged her documentation and shared their own stories of finding medicine in unexpected places. By spring of year 2, Sarah understood that her acre was not just growing random weeds in chaotic disorder. It was a perfectly balanced ecosystem that had evolved over decades of neglect into something more sophisticated than any human-designed garden. The deep taproots of the wild herbs had broken through the clay-hard pan, creating natural channels for water and nutrients that no tilling could have achieved. The mycorrhizal networks beneath the surface had established complex trading systems between plants that science was only beginning to understand. The so-called wasteland was actually a mature medicinal forest in miniature, and her attempts to clear it for vegetables had been ecological vandalism committed out of ignorance. Year 2 brought the first harvest and the first revenue that validated her vision and silenced her doubts. Sarah wildcrafted her herbs with sustainable methods she learned from indigenous wildcrafting traditions, never taking more than 30% of any stand, so the plants could regenerate and spread. She dried them in a borrowed barn space from a neighbor who had finally stopped laughing and started watching with the curiosity of someone witnessing a miracle they could not explain. She packaged them in simple glass jars with handwritten labels that told the story of where they grew and when they were harvested. Her first sales came from farmers' markets in nearby towns, where people initially bought out of pity for the thin woman with haunted eyes, but returned because the quality was unmistakable and the effects were real. Sarah's wild-crafted Echinacea had potency that cultivated varieties grown in perfect conditions could not match, because stress had forced the wild plants to produce more medicinal compounds. Her St. John's wort bloomed with hypericin levels that laboratory testing she eventually invested in confirmed were off the charts compared to commercial samples. She sold $200 worth of herbs in her first market day, money that felt like millions because it came from the land rather than a corporation. Then 500, then 1,000 in a single Saturday morning. She reinvested every penny into better drying equipment, proper packaging materials, and a small website she built herself during sleepless nights. She learned to make salves, teas, and concentrated extracts that expanded her product line. She read about organic certification and realized her land qualified immediately because she had never sprayed a single chemical or added a single synthetic fertilizer. The irony was not lost on her. The very neglect that made her property worthless to conventional farmers made it priceless to the growing natural medicine community that valued wild potency over cultivated conformity. Year 3 transformed her operation from cottage industry to serious business that demanded respect from everyone who had doubted her. Sarah built a proper drying facility using a converted shipping container she bought at auction and retrofitted with solar-powered ventilation that kept her herbs at optimal temperatures. She hired 2 local women who had been laid off from the textile mill that closed downtown, teaching them to identify and harvest herbs with the same care she had learned through painful trial and error. She established relationships with herbalists and naturopathic practitioners across Texas and Oklahoma who recognized quality when they saw it and were willing to pay premium prices for verified wildcrafted medicine. Her acre produced $15,000 in dried herbs that spring, a number that made her cry in her truck after counting it 3 times to make sure it was real. By fall, the number had doubled as word spread through the natural healing community like wildfire. She started receiving inquiries from herbal product companies who wanted wholesale supply contracts for quantities she could not yet imagine producing. A regional wellness chain placed a standing order for her adaptogenic blend that she could barely fulfill by working 18-hour days with blistered hands and a heart full of determination. Sarah expanded her cultivation not by clearing more land, but by allowing the wild stands to spread naturally into areas where she removed invasive species that choked the native medicine. She practiced what she called Kawama cooperative agriculture, where the plants taught her where they wanted to grow, and she simply protected and harvested according to their wisdom rather than her schedule or convenience. Her soil, once grey and cracked like a wound that would not heal, darkened with organic matter as the deep-rooted herbs pulled nutrients from the subsoil and deposited them on the surface when leaves fell and decomposed. The earth was healing itself through the very plants everyone had called weeds, and Sarah was simply witnessing and facilitating a process that had been waiting for someone patient enough to allow it. Year 4 brought the infrastructure that would scale her empire without destroying its soul or integrity. Sarah purchased the adjacent 5 acres using revenue from her herb business, though she never expanded her wildcrafting beyond what she could tend personally with integrity and attention to detail. She installed rainwater collection systems that captured Texas thunderstorms in massive tanks and a solar-powered processing facility that reduced her dependence on unreliable rural electrical grids. She obtained her organic certification and good manufacturing practice compliance that opened doors to larger markets and institutional buyers. She hired a chemist to standardize her extracts and a designer to professionalize her branding without losing the handmade authenticity customers loved. Her company, Wasteland Botanicals, launched its first retail product line in amber glass bottles that looked like medicine from a more careful era. The story of her transformation from corporate burnout to herb farmer became the narrative that customers connected with deeply on an emotional level that transcended commerce. People were not just buying herbs. They were buying the promise that broken things could become beautiful if given time and the right kind of attention. That year, her revenue crossed $300,000. She paid off her medical debt, bought a small house near her property with a porch where she could watch the sun rise over her empire, and established a scholarship for women leaving abusive relationships to learn herbalism and find their own healing in soil. The girl who had once calculated other people's wealth was now creating it from soil and sunlight and stubborn weeds that refused to apologize for their existence. Year 5 was the explosion that changed everything and proved her vision was not madness. A major national health food distributor discovered her products at a trade show in Denver and recognized something special in both the quality and the story. They wanted her adaptogenic tinctures in 3,000 stores across America. Sarah had to make a decision that terrified her more than any corporate presentation ever had. She could stay small and safe, preserving her control and her connection to every plant, Or she could scale and risk losing the quality that had built her reputation. She chose scale, but with conditions that reflected everything she had learned about respect and patience. She partnered with other small organic herb farms in Texas to meet demand while maintaining her wildcrafted signature line from her original acre that would never be mechanized or industrialized. She built a commercial extraction facility in a nearby town that employed 23 people from the local community, including several who had previously laughed at her land purchase. Her original 1-acre became the research and seed sanctuary, where she developed new cultivars and preserved rare medicinal varieties that were disappearing from the American landscape. Revenue that year hit $800,000. Sarah appeared on regional television and national podcasts where hosts loved the irony of her story. Journalists loved the narrative of the woman who bought the Devil's Acre and turned it into a Garden of Eden. But Sarah always corrected them gently. She had not turned it into anything. She had simply stopped fighting what it already was, and allowed it to become what it had always wanted to be. Year 6 cemented her empire in ways that exceeded her most desperate hopes. Wasteland Botanicals went from regional player to national brand recognized in health food stores from Portland to Miami. Sarah's adaptogenic blends were featured in major wellness publications that called her the farmer who listened to weeds. Her original 1-acre, still producing its wild medicines in their natural patterns, became a pilgrimage site for herbalism students who wanted to learn cooperative agriculture from the woman who had pioneered it, without knowing she was pioneering anything. She published a memoir that spent 14 weeks on the business bestseller list, not because she was a great writer, but because her story resonated with millions of people who felt broken by systems that demanded they be something they were not. She spoke at conferences about ecological listening, the practice of observing land before demanding from it, and applied those same principles to human potential and organizational leadership. Her company revenue passed $1.5 million. She established a foundation that purchased degraded agricultural land across the American South and converted it back to native medicinal plant habitats, proving that her acre was not a miracle, but a model that could be replicated. Her ex-husband sent her a letter apologizing for his cruelty during her lowest moment, which she read once and filed away without response, because she no longer needed his validation or his regret. Her mother finally visited the property and cried while holding a bundle of dried Echinacea that had saved her daughter's health and fortune. The real estate agent, who had begged her not to buy the land, asked if she had any investment advice for his other clients. Sarah smiled and told him to start looking at weeds differently, because they might be the most valuable thing on any property he ever listed. By year 7, the $2 million milestone was not just reached, but exceeded with room to grow. Wasteland Botanicals reported $2.3 million in annual revenue, with profit margins that made her former investment firm look inefficient and short-sighted. Sarah employed 47 people full-time and supported over 200 wildcrafters and small herb farmers through her supplier network that prioritized fair prices over exploitative margins. Her original 1-acre remained the spiritual and botanical heart of the empire, unchanged in its wildness, still producing medicine that laboratory testing consistently showed was superior to cultivated alternatives grown in perfect conditions. She had never tilled it, never sprayed it, never forced it to be anything other than what the decades of neglect had created through natural selection and ecological wisdom. The wild herbs still grew in their natural patterns, still attracted the butterflies and bees, still produced medicine that healed people who had lost faith in conventional solutions. Sarah had proven that the most valuable agricultural assets were not the perfectly manicured fields of monoculture crops that depleted soil and required constant chemical intervention. They were the misunderstood ecosystems that conventional agriculture discarded as waste, because they did not fit into spreadsheets or harvesting schedules or the narrow definitions of productivity that had nearly killed her. Before I tell you about the final lesson Sarah learned through blood and sweat and enough tears to water an acre, I want to ask you something that matters to me personally. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments, because I am genuinely curious how far this story is traveling across screens and borders. I read every single comment, and I want to know if there is someone out there sitting on their own version of a wasteland right now, wondering if it is worth the fight or if the laughter is too loud to ignore. Tell me where you are, and tell me if you have ever had someone laugh at a dream that turned out to be exactly what you needed. Your comment might be the thing that helps someone else realize they are not alone in their wilderness. The lesson Sarah Mitchell wants you to remember is simple, but it cost her everything she had to learn it through failure and isolation, and the kind of desperation that most people never experience. The world will always laugh at what it does not understand, because laughter is easier than learning and mockery requires less courage than curiosity. Your wasteland might be a relationship that everyone says you should leave or stay in. It might be a career that looks like a dead end to everyone else. It might be a body that doctors say cannot heal, or a piece of land that everyone else has abandoned as worthless. The laughter is not evidence that you are wrong. It is evidence that they are not looking closely enough, or listening carefully enough, or waiting patiently enough for the truth to reveal itself. Sarah's $2 million herb empire did not come from changing her acre into something it was not through force and chemicals and domination. It came from having the courage to see what it already was when everyone else was blinded by conventional definitions of value that they had inherited without questioning. The weeds were never weeds. They were waiting for someone desperate enough to need them. The soil was never dead. It was resting and rebuilding beneath the surface, where no one bothered to look. And you are never broken beyond repair. You are simply in your season of becoming what you have always been underneath the expectations of people who never had to survive what you survived. Stop trying to turn your wasteland into someone else's garden. Listen to what it is trying to grow. That is where your empire waits. That is where your healing begins. And that is the story of how they laughed at her 1-acre wasteland until the weeds turned into a $2 million herb empire that changed everything she believed about value and worth, and the wisdom of the wild things we are too quick to destroy.